with I was talking, or actually just a few minutes ago, texting with John Shaver and checking in with him today on how he's doing today on the first anniversary of him losing his house and losing his church and losing pretty much everything owned in the physical material world to get it back to what we're going to be talking about today as well. And you know, so today I want to dedicate our studies to those people who are commemorating an anniversary, if you will, a year, which to some extent becomes like an anniversary or a new year for them, because as much as it's like a personal yard site or a time of losing, an anniversary of losing somebody, I have a feeling that they're going to be thinking about this day for the rest of their lives. Is where am I on this January 7th as opposed to last January 7th? This is what we do at the new year on January 1st, or we do it at Rosh Hashanah. These are times for us to think about it. So today, I'm thinking about those people that are now working on a calendar or a connection to that date. So I think about them today, and again, everybody who is joining has joined us there or whatever. But I told John we're going to dedicate our studies to him tonight. So I think we just went up on Facebook. Are we on Facebook, Mike? You sometimes check that. Thank you. Um, yeah, and today we're going to be doing the first of what will be a couple of classes. We don't do this a lot, but sometimes we get into a subject that requires more than one time of discussing it. Um, and to some extent, we did that with the Siddur, with the prayer book. By the way, all of our classes, actually, unfortunately, except for one, didn't make it up on YouTube. But all the previous classes, the 13 previous classes, are all up except for one. Um, but I mean, to some extent, when we looked at Jewish prayer, we looked at the development of the synagogue, from the temple to the synagogue, and then we looked at the prayer book and the Siddur, the development of the prayers, on two separate classes. But Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism definitely requires more than one class. And I believe it'll be three classes, though I'm willing to put it into the fourth if we don't get to it. I definitely want people today, because sometimes I think people are hesitant to jump in or to stop and kind of stop us while we're talking and discussing stuff. If something doesn't make sense or if you don't understand something, please please jump in and ask a question. So if there's something that again is flying over your head, don't worry about uh, interrupting. For those who are here, for those who are online, if you're on Facebook, sorry, we won't be able to hear you, but post your question in Facebook if you're there. Um, so I want to make sure that everybody does that, because there's definitely things as we study to where um, can get a little esoteric and it can get a little cloudy and murky. And that's one of the things that I think is maybe unique for the study of Kabbalah, of all the subjects that we study, because there was intentionally a level of murkiness and inaccessibility to Kabbalah or to Jewish mysticism as a kind of barrier to keep people out. And part of that we're going to get to right away. Part of it I want to hold till the end, to the last class, because what's interesting is that there was a serious attempt at stopping that, at breaking down that barrier of inaccessibility. And it was done right here, and it's being done right here in Los Angeles at the Kabbalah Center in LA, which is one of the reasons why so many people have heard of Kabbalah, because of the celebrities and because of the Hollywood attachment to Kabbalah. But what was interesting, and we'll get to it, I promise, when we talk about kind of as we go through this, and that that's there was maybe a good intention in doing that to some extent, but there's also something that's really counterproductive in doing that with Kabbalah. So first of all, when we use the word Kabbalah, we're usually talking about Jewish mysticism as an entirety. The phrase wasn't used initially for Jewish mysticism. Originally, there's not a thing that we would call, and there is no book called Kabbalah. Though you will see books that say Kabbalah, there was no, and there was never intentionally a book called Kabbalah. With the development of Kabbalistic teachings over the years, you will see dozens of books that say Kabbalah. They're just not, they were just not necessarily written by people who were intentionally trying to teach you traditional Jewish law. So I've seen dozens of books at Barnes and Noble. It's not like it's at a Judaica store. There's dozens of books that will just say Kabbalah on the front, but there isn't really a book, or there wasn't a book. And Kabbalah literally means revelation, or it is the reception. Kibel in Hebrew means to receive. It's the root of the word Kabbalat Shabbat, to receive Shabbat. It's the same root. Kabel means to bring in, to receive. So when we get into Kabbalat Shabbat, when we get to Friday night, we welcome in Shabbat. Kabbalah is receiving or revealed connection to God. And I just posted up here something that I'll also post up on our website, so you'll be able to download this. There is a development over time, and that's what we're really going to be talking about a lot today, is the development of Jewish mysticism. And again, when we say Kabbalah, we're talking about, a phrase that starts to come up in the Middle Ages. But initially, we know that, and again, beyond the red strings and the celebrities and everything else and the magic, within the Bible, within the Torah, are mystical incidents. There are connections and appearances of God, which we would say are mystical elements within the text, within the Torah itself. So when we really want to talk about Kabbalah, where does it start? It starts at the beginning. It starts at the Torah. And some would say one of the most Kabbalistic elements in the entire Bible is the beginning, is Genesis chapter 1. And so for our ancestors, when they talk about how do we understand God, or how do we experience God, you go back to the beginning. You go back to literally the first words of creation. And it is a place where people would study and expound on it. And what's interesting is, in a couple of weeks, on our Tuesday morning class, we're going to be going back to Genesis. And so when we study chapter 1 of Genesis in a few weeks, we will definitely look at it somewhat through a Kabbalistic lens, because it's impossible not to. It's impossible to read creation without thinking about it. And our ancestors knew that, because this is Kabbalistic. This is the rabbis knew it. So in the Talmud, I'm going to actually show you the line in the Mishnah, the oldest part of the Talmud. The rabbis are already cautioning people, don't study those texts without careful guidance. And so the rabbis are actually cautioning us that there's parts of the Bible itself that, if you're not careful, you're going to go down a rabbit hole. And it's dangerous for your mind. So they understood that. And it's been a cautionary, and as I said, to some extent, one of the reasons why Jewish mysticism has been made inaccessible is because throughout time, there's always been this recognition that this is something that, if you're not prepared for it, it can be dangerous. And not because you're going to necessarily blow things up, but because you could lose your mind. have that very famous discussion that we saw, that we've studied before in the Talmud, of the four rabbis who entered paradise, right? Eva, Acher, otherwise the other, who's also known as Elisha ben Abuya, his original name, before he's called Acher, the other, Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. And these four rabbis engage in some type of mystical contemplation. They enter into this together. Only one of them comes out okay. Rabbi Akiva is the only one, and he's considered literally the greatest sage of his 135. He's martyred, as we know, during the Bar Kokhba revolt, but he lives about 60 years after the temple is destroyed, 100 years after the time the Christian Bible says Jesus lived. Those times were times when definitely people were talking about Jewish mysticism. They were kind of going inward. So the fact that we have that story is interesting, but it continues. Now, some people say that Jewish thought the inward kind of contemplation of these kinds of divine secrets were a reflection of Jewish, the reality of Jewish history, which was oftentimes very difficult. That as Jews were persecuted, they warred, and they studied and kind of like became experts at this kind of contemplation. That there might be an element to that. I'm not saying that can't be true, but it doesn't quite ring true, because the mystical studies within Judaism are throughout history. So it's not like it was only during the pogroms, it was only during the Crusades. It's been consistent. And so this sheet that I will share with you, kind of focuses on the main waves of Jewish mysticism, but this has gone on throughout history. I mean, persecution is also gone throughout history, but not necessarily. You're saying the story of Rabbi Akiva? I'll show. Well, yes, we'll look at it in a second. But the cautionary tales mirror and are always exist in all of these times, including, by the way, well, let me give you one of the more famous ones, which is the one from Maimonides, who again lives during the Middle Ages. He lives around the time, just before the time that the Zohar, and we're going to get to that. That's coming. He lives during that time. He is the one who famously says, you're not supposed to study this until you're at least 40, which I think everybody might be here, except for Rachel. Rachel doesn't qualify, but it was thought as now, I will say, it also disqualifies most of the people here right now. Women were not supposed to study it, but that was mainly because women were not studying any of the texts. And it was 40 years old, and people who were deeply grounded in Jewish study already. So it wasn't just you're 40, it's you're 40 and you already are familiar with the Talmud. You're already familiar with Jewish texts. And again, the reason was, the Rambam said, and he was a very rational and very almost anti-mystical person to begin with, he didn't like magic. He didn't like amulets. He didn't like people speculating on the secrets of God. I mean, he knew they were secrets, but he didn't want people to kind of access them, if you will. So he was very kind of cautionary about all mystical things, but he really said people need to be grounded in life before they start this, because he was following texts from within the Mishnah itself, which tell us, I'm going to show you this right here. This is from the Mishnah. It says, this is all part of it. One may not expound on the topic of forbidden sexual relations before three or more individuals, nor one may expound the act of creation and the secrets of the beginning of the world before two or more individuals, nor may one expound by oneself the design of the divine chariot unless he is wise and understands most matters on his own. Now, the weird one, of course, that I haven't gotten to is this one about forbidden sexual relations. That's obviously a part of the Torah, which isn't really connected into the other ones from the standpoint of, well, that's not necessarily mystical, but creation and God's chariot are definitely basics a basis for mystical. So um, it says, whoever looks at four matters, it would have been better for him that he never enter the world. Anyone who reflects on what is above the firmament, what is below the earth, what was before creation, and what will be after the world. And anyone who has no concern for the honor of his maker, who inquires into and deals with matters not permitted to him, deserves to have never come to the world. Look, clearly it's not about the forbidden sexual relations. It's not concern. I mean, that's where they started it as a kind of an introduction to, like, be careful what you talk about with certain people. But the rest of this is clearly about mysticism. Here's my water. Understand that the rabbis just told us that the material is in front of us. It's in the Torah, but it's a question of how we look at it. And specifically, again, how we're gonna look at it, how we're gonna focus on it. If we're reading the Torah to kind of understand what God wants us to do and what we're supposed to do in this world, well, studying creation isn't going to be a problem. But if you're studying creation to try to figure out, but what was there before God? What was there before creation? They're saying that's a dangerous thing to do. Now, part of it, of course, is if people don't have a grounding in tradition, they're going to go off the deep end. They're going to start studying magical things that are maybe not Jewish, maybe not Jewish ways of looking at creation, Jewish ways of looking at what happens beyond creation. So it was more of what it would lead to religiously than a question of the science to it, which is why Jews have never had an issue with studying science at a metaphysical level, at a astrophysics. I mean, you have Jews all around the world that are very religious who study some very deep topics of cosmology. But it's studied from a scientific perspective, not what if God isn't there? What if God wasn't there at the very beginning? What if God came later? We're going to maybe get to this. But the words at the very beginning say Bereshit bara Elohim. And so when the rabbis say, be careful of how you study this, those are the first three words of the Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim, which is usually created as in the beginning. Bereshit means in the beginning. Bereshit is at the beginning. Bara, created. Elohim. Now, we know that Hebrew doesn't necessarily order the verb and the noun the same way that English does. But literally in English, that translates to, in the beginning was created God. Now, that's in the Zohar, by the way. I didn't make that up. This isn't me throwing out some idea that you're now going to think about for the rest of the evening. But the Kabbalistic understanding that maybe what God created initially was a version of God's self that can interact in the world. That is to say that there's a God before creation that didn't really kind of access creation the way God would create. Think about that for a second. Now, this is also based on some of the dualistic Gnostic teachings that existed well before, at the time of the Talmud already. It was already the Zoroastrian and some of the Gnostic influences that are already floating around out there, which are talking about a physical world that's essentially evil in a was not necessarily, again, wasn't necessarily a Jewish idea, but it did have an influence on Jewish ideas. So Gnostic dualism, we have works that come from earlier than some of the Jewish works that talk about these things that are very similar to what we see in some of these Gnostic texts, which were very popular amongst people 2,000 years ago. Had a huge influence on forms of Christianity that eventually the church kind of worked against. But this idea of there maybe being a God who's the energy, a God of goodness, and then a God who makes the physical world, sometimes called the demiurge, that these ideas were around. And they definitely had an impact on some of the Jewish texts that we have to this day. Again, some of these ideas, they bury themselves in our head and we can't get out of them. And so the rabbis said in the Mishnah, as I just showed you, it's better that you never did it. Don't think about it. And this is something that they said 2,000 years ago, and it's something they still say today. I'm not necessarily recommending this movie because, like all of his movies, it's deeply disturbing, and it was his first directorial feature. Darren Aronofsky's first movie is a movie called Pi, not Life of Pi, just Pi. And it's a black and white movie, and it's his first movie. But you'll see things in that movie that he has in all of his movies, which are, this movie is disturbing, and it intentionally disturbs you. And the movie is literally about a Jewish guy who tries to figure out the numerical sequences that control everything, that are behind everything. And he meets and talks. There's several scenes. There's a whole part of the movie which is about him talking with Kabbalists and talking about Jewish mysticism and figuring out a synthesis between his work in math and God's name, which has numerical significance. And again, I mean, I don't want to get into the movie, but you're never really sure whether it really is happening or whether he's having a nervous breakdown. And I don't want to tell you what happens in the movie because, again, it's so disturbing and so weird, but it essentially ends with this idea, it's better for him never to have done this. So, yeah, that idea has not left us. That idea is still there. And so I'm not worried about it because we're going to be doing this in 3 classes and we're going to sketch this. I will give you some resources of texts and videos that I think are going to be helpful. There's some really great material out there. If you want to learn more, then I will post, which we've done in the past, for all the classes. So there's definitely ways to learn more. But but this is one of those subjects where I'm like, but let me make sure that people are reading like legitimate stuff, because there's a lot of stuff out there on Kabbalah that is not legitimate and is insane, some of it. But that's because there's probably people that have kind of gone off the deep end on this. So we knew that. We knew that it could do that, which is why it's oftentimes restricted and why it's, the idea was just don't go down that road. So the problem, as I said, is that it's right there. You can't study creation and not think about this. What does this mean? What is creation? What was there before? So it's there at the beginning, and it's there several other places in the Bible that are, I think, pretty mystical scenes. I mean, one of them at the beginning of Exodus, where Moses finally encounters God at the burning bush and says, "What's your name, God? What do we call you?" And God says, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I am what I am," or "I will be what I will be," or "I am what I will be." It's a word that we can't even describe, but it is the basic, the components of that asher ehyeh is Yud He Vav He, the name we don't pronounce. The name we call Shem HaMeforsham, the name that is the ineffable name, the name we don't pronounce, the name we say Adonai for, or Hashem, the name we don't write. So That's another scene. And there's another scene that the rabbis just mentioned, which is the divine chariot. Now, we used to have a picture of the divine chariot up here, Sarah Renson's picture of the vision of Ezekiel, what's called in Hebrew the Merkavah. Now, reflections on what we would call Ezekiel's chariot or the Merkavah is an area where people would study and meditate on it. And it would cause people to then also reflect on what is heaven like? If that's God's chariot, where's heaven? What does heaven look like? And that is the basis for what we'll look at or just mention here briefly. We talk about the development of Kabbalistic texts. We start to see these early Jewish books. They're what we call hechalot literature. These are after the Bible, these are the first I would say Kabbalistic or mystical texts that we have. Yeah. Yeah, that people do. Yeah. So in case you didn't hear what Esther's question, which is if you say something's restricted, you're just encouraging people to do it. And that is true. And people did do it. But putting that kind of caution within the Jewish framework for people who, let's face it, Esther, the people who were being exposed to this or who knew it were studying with rabbis and with under a halachic framework anyways, where they're supposed to follow the rules. Of course, that not everybody follows the rules, right? There's laws that people are always breaking out of the Torah. We know that. Wouldn't be there if they were naturally going to follow those laws. But when you have that as a rule, as a guideline, then you don't go to your rabbi and go, hey, teach me some Kabbalah. Guy looks at you and goes, you know what the rule is? Did people always abide by the rule? Probably not. If they saw some student that they thought could handle it. But there's enough cautionary tales where people said, yeah, I thought that kid could handle it, and he couldn't. Because the fear, again, was that if you teach somebody who's not yet married or who hasn't started a family, they're going to get wrapped up in this, and they're never, I didn't get it. I didn't say this. I'll say it now. The fear is that these kids would get lost into it. They would never get married. They would never start a family. They would never do anything other than read this stuff. And so, like, when we're talking about, like, how do we preserve the tradition, you don't want to create a tradition that's going to cause people to go off the deep end. So people took it seriously. I mean, they took the caution seriously. Look, I also believe that at a certain point, why are people studying this? And maybe we'll get to that, though maybe we'll always be there, which is why are people intrigued by this? Why are people intrigued by Kabbalah? Why is this even something that people care about in the first place? And that is, I think, pretty obvious. People are searching for systems. They're searching for a way to make sense of the world. They're searching for the secret. They're searching for something that's going to unlock the answers to help them have a better life, or get a lot of money, or just be able to not have the bad things happen. Now, I think,
or just get through life, Rabbi.
Yeah, but generally speaking, people are getting through life. They want to really have an answer for this stuff, and they want to do better than they would do otherwise. Let's put it that way. And Judaism definitely has always discouraged the easy way out, if you will. So there's definitely that, which is that it takes work, right? You're just going to have to put in the time. And I think when people really started doing it, they'd be like, well, I don't know, I must not be doing it right, because I've tied this red string around me and I still haven't gotten it, I still haven't gotten the money, or I still haven't gotten pregnant yet, or whatever it was that they wanted. they just say it's not working yet. So maybe I'm not doing it right, or maybe this thing doesn't work. Now I'm going to tell you something. I think we'll get to it. I have no idea what we're going to get to today, but I will tell you this. I guess keep this in mind. I probably should get to a little bit before I say this. One of the really wild things that I think, and again, this is something that I studied well before I was 40, because not because somebody told me I wasn't supposed to, just because it was there and I started studying it. Um, the interesting thing is that like when you really understand what are the basic principles of Kabbalistic teachings, and again, you could say this is kind of like many mystical systems, not just Judaism, but I know Judaism really well, so I'll just say it's there. The funny thing is, and the ironic thing is that for people who are trying to understand, like, how do I game the system through this, right? The weird thing is that if you really look at it, right, if you really understand Kabbalistic principles, you don't need to accumulate more because you already have that. What we'll see in a moment, not maybe not this moment, but soon, a moment soon, is that one of the things that Kabbalah teaches us when we get to this discussion about the worlds that we exist in, the four dimensions that we exist in simultaneously, we also are existing in a place we just don't feel it all the time, where I am not separated from you, and all the stuff that you have or I have or that we think we have is an illusion. It's all the same. Everything is connected. Everything is energy. Everything is God. So the idea of like trying to hold on to that or trying to own all that is ridiculous because it's all there anyways. You already all have it. It's just we create these our brain, our human brain, our mind, that is our physical body mind, not our soul, but our mind needs to make those separations. We can't, our physical self can't understand that. We can't comprehend that. And so we create these, we live in an illusion where, or we live in a dimension where those things are separated. So we think we need it because it's not ours, it's not us, but it already is. So that's the crazy thing is that once you actually kind of like experience that or understand that, you don't really care about it anymore. But that's that's to some extent built into the system, and we'll get to that. Like I said, I think we'll touch on it hopefully today, because I do want to get into some. I want to show the development, but I also want to get into some practical discussions. Uh, anything before I get into this sheet right now, because this is what we're going to be studying for the next few minutes. Anybody? I don't want to jump ahead. Yes.
Yeah. What about this book on Amazon, Kabbalah for Dummies? You know, the Dummies
It's
books.
actually a great book, Arthur Kurzweil, right?
Yeah. Really? It's a good book.
I'll, Philip, you're jumping ahead. I will post. That is one of the books I'm going to post if you want to read more about it. Yes. But you're jumping ahead. I promise it'll be up there. All the other classes I have read more about it with links, suggested books. That will definitely be on it. I promise. It's actually a very good. Some of the For Dummies books are really good. Arthur Kurzweil happens to be. He passed away. He happened to have been a very accomplished writer and a guy who can bridge. He was able to bridge Hasidic and non-Hasidic texts very well. So yes, it's a good
I
book.
remember when we were in Israel in 2023 in February, we were we were up in Shafed, and you told us a story about some young man who was under 30 who read, was it the Zohan or
Zohar, yeah,
yeah,
the
and
Zohar,
they
the
told him
Zohar, yeah,
not to. They told him not to. They told him not to, and he lost his mind.
yeah. Well, that's the story we're gonna get to. But yeah, because again, if you're not prepared for it, uh, you no, Arthur Kurzweil is still alive. Thank God. Kabbalah for Dummies. It's for the one of For Dummies books. No, Arthur Kurzweil is still alive. Thankfully, so he's 74. Um, and he does a lot of different stuff. Has written a lot of different kinds of books. All right, so back to our historical overview. I promise we'll get to that though. Philip, um, let's take a look at um, after we see these texts in the Bible. As I mentioned, the Talmud talks about um, the days of going into these texts too much, but they're clearly there. These mystical this mystical speculation of what I just showed you, and we know. I'll show you this too. Darn it! There's so much to show you. So, so there is so much to show you. So this another text from the Talmud. So we know the rabbis were engaging in mystical practices. Here's a famous discussion in the Talmud. Um, this is a discussion about magic. Okay, I'm going to say this now, and if I forget to say it later, this is one of the main issues: is that Kabbalah is not supposed to become magic. Jewish mysticism is not supposed to become magic because we're not supposed to do magic. And by the way, that's different than magic because interesting, Arthur Kurzweil is actually a magician too, or he does magic. There's a difference between magic that's sleight of hand and deception, and then there's what wizards and warlocks and witches are doing. That's not okay. Now, interestingly, the Bible and the Talmud never say that there are people who can't do things that defy explanation for real, not just sleight of hand. Now, sleight of hand, they really don't have an issue with. The rabbis say in the Talmud right here, they say it right here, that it says right here that hold it one second. I went too far. That deceptions of the eyes, they're not sorcery. Now, you're not supposed to do that, but it's not a problem. But, and these are just discussions about different magic, different things that were done. Hold it. Where's the text I'm looking for? Sorry. I'm looking on the other side here. Here. There are some of the laws of sorcery which one is liable to be executed by stoning, and there are some of them where one is exempt from punishment from Torah law, but they're prohibited by rabbinic law. And there are some of them that are permitted ab initio, which means you already did it. It's not really a problem. It's not going to be a problem. But people are having, like the Talmud says, that like rabbis were creating golems. I mean, the first golem is mentioned in the Talmud. And here's one that's really famous. Um, look, if you're really performing acts of sorcery, you can be stoned to death. One who deceives the eye is exempt from punishment, but is prohibited from doing so. So you're not really supposed to be a magician, but if you tell people you're a magician, it's like it's okay. That's why, like, Harry Houdini is the greatest Jewish magician of all time. Blaine Copperfield. There's a lot of Jewish magicians. But the rabbis, here's a story. It says Rav Hanina and Rav Shaya, every Shabbat Eve, they would engage in the study of the halachot of creation. They'd study about creation, and a third-born calf would be created for them, and they would eat it for Shabbat. Now, it doesn't seem like they were saying, hocus pocus, create me a calf so I can have it for Shabbat. But they're doing something that they get a calf created for them every Shabbat to eat. That's not normal. That's not something that people normally did. So either through what they were saying or because they were saying things that were pleasing to God, they had a calf created for them so they could eat meat every Shabbat. I don't know, but that was okay. So there's clearly stuff that's going on that is okay, but there's other stuff that's not okay. And again, what's the difference? If you're doing it with God's, if you're following the Torah and if you're doing it for the sake of God. It doesn't say they were creating they didn't say, God, make me a cow, but they were studying and they were kind of rewarded with the cow. So that's
So
kind of where the rabbis are saying.
how do they get away with amulets? You know, that like for Lilith against Lilith, or is that not magical?
How do they get away with it?
Yes,
How do Jews get away with it? So this is a great question that Gail is asking us. And the answer is because it was so prevalent. Rambam warned against it 900 years ago. Maimonides said, don't do it. And people continue to do it. Now, is it the worst form of magic that people do? No. But he said not to do it, and people continue to do it. Why? Because they wanted to do it. It was so prevalent. It was so much a part of people's consciousness. And again, Gail, for the Lilith ones, the ones that were done to protect a baby from Lilith, because infant mortality was so high, people did anything they could. And to some extent, the rabbis kind of said, you know what? We'd rather you not have angelic protection amulets, but you know what? For the sake of, and I showed those to you when we talked about the Midrash. I showed you the angels protecting us from Lilith. You know what? We'll allow it occasionally.
Good. I mean, you're calling on our angels.
I know, but again, they're not supposed to, but it's not the worst. It's not the worst thing. And again, did it work? I don't know, but people felt so helpless against, babies dying that they kind of said, it's not, at least they're not praying to another deity. There are discussions, by the way, in the Talmud. I showed them to you for those who were studying the Talmud with us a few, 6 or 7 months ago. There were people that were praying in Jesus' name during the time of the Talmud. And the Talmud says, don't do that. You're using magic. They already were saying, don't do that, which means people were doing it. So that was one of the ways the Talmud kind of said, hey, this is not Judaism anymore, because they saw it as magic. They saw it as a form of magic. So by the time the Talmud is finished in about 600, again, when the Gemara is finished, we already have this book we call the Sefer Yetzirah. We have Hechalot literature, which are shorter texts that deal with the heavenly palaces and angels, divine names. Some of those Hechalot literature make their way into what we call the pseudepigrapha, the books that did make it into the Bible, but are visions of what heaven looks like, long lists of angel names. And around this time, too, we have what's called the Sefer Yetzirah, which is the first book that we would say is a Jewish mystical book, which the goal of it is to kind of formalize the texts that deal with Jewish mysticism. So, I mean, I'll post some links. You can read it. It's very unreadable for most people because it's referencing things that you have to kind of understand, not just what they're talking about from the biblical standpoint, but what they're talking about from the Talmudic. Some of you who have studied Talmud might get some of it now, but it really is it's one of the earliest attempts. So before the Zohar, we have this book, the Sefer Yetzirah, which literally means the book of formation. It's one of the levels of creation is Sefer Yetzirah. And so are these books studied by lots of people? No, but they're known, and people do. They do have some understanding of this. As I mentioned, one of the most famous Hechalot texts in the Talmud, because there is a Hechalot text in the Talmud, is this one. Give me 1 second. And this is so this is the discussion, and I think for those who've studied it, you'll recognize it when we study it. So let me go to it without the commentary. Hold it a second. Here we go. So this section in the Talmud deals with some of the visions of heaven. Kind of it's thrown out, and then there's this famous story. Here it is. The sages taught there were 4 who entered the orchard, paradise or pardes, which again they say is the loftiest secrets of the Torah, but it could be again trying to go into heaven. And they are as follows: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, which is the name for Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the senior among them, said to them, upon your arrival in the upper worlds, you reach pure marble stones. Do not say, water, water, although they appear to be water. Because it is stated, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before my eyes. It's a line from the Psalms. So you're up in heaven, you see something that looks like water, don't call it water. Because if you do, you're going to get thrown out. I mean, that's it. It's over. The Gemara proceeds to relate what happened to each of them. Ben Azai glimpsed at the divine presence and died. And with regard to him, the verse said, precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his pious ones, also from Psalms. Ben Zoma glimpsed at the divine presence and was harmed. He was hurt, which they understood to be he lost his mind. And with regard to him, the verse states, have you found honey? Eat as much as sufficient for you, lest you become full from it and vomit it. That's from Proverbs. Acher chopped down the shoots of saplings. In other words, he became a heretic. We talked about Acher, Elisha ben Abuya. He goes to the dark side. We don't know exactly what the dark side was, but he went there, right? And he does not come back. Finally, his student, remember, Rabbi Meir, prays for him, and it seems as though he's rescued from whatever future torment that he was put into, but it was not good. We don't know what he did. We don't know how he went, whether he became a pagan, whether he became a wizard, whether he became a Christian. I mean, there's lots of speculation of what Acher did, but they didn't call him Elisha ben Abuya anymore. They called him the other Acher. That's how scared they were of him, if you will. Rabbi Akiva came out safely. So that's the end of it. They then talk about these guys. It has nothing to do with, I don't even want to show you what the rest of the discussion is, but it's not about anything other than that. I mean, that's it. That's the discussion of paradise, of what happens. It's a cautionary tale. And when we talk about, like, why would people not do it? If your odds are not good, that if you go into this, that you're going to come out okay. So people definitely reflected on it. They dabbled in it, but they were very cautious to not spend too much time in it. And so we see initially, again, warnings within the Talmud itself about what to do with this, which is better for you not to get involved. The next major development as far as where we see a text from Kabbalistic and mystical sources is the Sefer HaBahir, which is also an attempt to try to formalize some of what exists in Jewish mysticism, but nothing comes close to the Zohar, which is a commentary on the Torah and was written in the late 1200s. The Zohar literally means the shiny, the to shine like light, the emanation of light. And like the word Zahara or Zahor, or Zahar, not Zahor, but Zahar, Zahir. This text was attributed to Shimon ben Yochai, to the rabbi who lived in the time of, right around the time of Rabbi Akiva. But we know when it was written, and we know the person who wrote it, Moshe de Leon, who was from the area of France and Spain that a lot of this, during the Middle Ages, a lot of this Kabbalistic teaching was coming out of. Again, it wasn't like he discovered this stuff in the Zohar. He doesn't even claim to. He doesn't want to, which is why he said it was written 1,000 years before. Now you say, like, why didn't he claim this? Because he didn't want to say that he's making these ideas up. And he didn't make these ideas up. These ideas were percolating for 1,000 years, but even to some extent, 2,000 years by this point. So it's not like, it's not like these were new necessarily. But he also didn't want to claim it because if he claims it, there's no basis of authority for it. If he says that Shimon bar Yochai said it, then one of the greatest sages of that period during the Talmud is the person who said it. And so he attributes it to Bar Yochai, and that's why most Jewish scholars will say it's about 1,000 years old, 900 years old. But there are people who say it's 2,000 years old. So the Zohar is written in Aramaic. It's written definitely with an understanding of texts that had only been around for a couple of 100 years or maybe even 100 years. It's one of the reasons why we know kind of when it was written. And we know the guy who claimed to have made it accessible. So we understand where it came from, and we understand, and again, this is where some people say, well, it was written during a time when Jews were being persecuted in Spain. Well, they were being persecuted several times while they were in Spain, but this is 200 years before the exile, 1492, during Columbus's time. So it wasn't the biggest time of Jewish persecution. So, it was written in that area of Spain, France, where there was a major Jewish community and a lot of Jewish study. And there are ideas that we finally see in the Zohar where we can look at them in writing and say, oh, okay, so Jews believe that during the Middle Ages. And some of them are really, really different from the things we saw in the Talmud or in the Torah, like that God is also a woman. It's in the Zohar that we first really come across very articulated discussions about God as the Shekhinah, as the divine feminine, where we're going, oh, okay, well, at least by that time, these ideas were there, and maybe they were there earlier, but here it's articulated. And when we start to see some of again, the Zohar allows us to kind of say, okay, this is where these ideas came, that are the basis for the Kabbalah that we have today. And so a lot of times people say the Zohar is Kabbalah. It's not. It's the most important book of Kabbalah. I'm not going to say you shouldn't say that. If somebody says, well, what Kabbalistic text you know? Definitely if you say the Zohar, you're correct. But it's not all of Kabbalah. And it's also a version of the Kabbalah which is not nearly as developed as what we have today. And so some people are studying it going, well, where's that idea? Not there yet. It's going to be there, but you're seeing the kernel of it there. It's not there yet. Yeah. Well, So
What's
Esther
the
said,
question,
why,
Rabbi?
if so Esther said, if God also exists in the divine form, shouldn't women be studying it? No, no, no. Oh no. It no. The idea that God also manifests as feminine, it's not like that couldn't have existed before. It's just we don't see it articulated until this period of time. Do um how do we get from how do we get to that point? It's a long time. I mean, not a long time. It's 1,000 years. Um, the reason why. So Esther is that why people didn't want God to be a woman? The women women were not supposed to study Kabbalah because they were not supposed to be studying Torah. It's not because they weren't supposed to study Kabbalah. They weren't if they weren't no one was supposed to study Kabbalah unless they were grounded in Torah. And the assumption was women weren't grounded in Torah, so they couldn't. It wasn't because they were going to be exposed to the idea of God being a woman. Look, one of the difficulties with the divine feminine within Judaism for at least the first 1,000 years of Judaism was because of what Judaism ran up against with paganism. And this is a really not, I don't like this answer, but I think it's the answer. And so I'm going to offer the answer. Judaism, for the first 1,000 years of its existence, we know this. We just read it in Tuesday's class. Every time there was a good king that knocked down all the Baal, and by the way, the Baal statues were accompanied by the Asherah, Baal's wife. Asherah is the consort of Baal. Every time they're destroying these idols, the next king builds them back up. It's constant. So this is the answer that is not a great answer, but it's the answer I think is true. I can't prove it. It's not my answer, but I think it's a legit answer. Judaism always wanted there to be only one God that's not a woman, non-anthropomorphic. God is not a man or woman. Nobody wanted to hear that. They still don't want to hear it. People wanted God to be a man or a woman or something that they could see. Judaism always fought with that until around 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. So around the time of when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, people by that point, Jews they'd gotten over. Look, it's not like some of them didn't become pagan, but for the most part, Jews were like, okay, we get it. God is one, and God is beyond all form. All these ideas are super important in Kabbalistic teaching, but they were freed enough from the idea of God being a woman because they didn't see God necessarily as either. But by that point, all the language about God is male. And I think it's because the priests and the rabbis and all the people that formulated Judaism said, if we keep God a man, if we keep using the term, we have to use a gender term for it. There's no non-gendered nouns in Hebrew. So if we use the phraseology and the attributes of God as a male, we got to pick one or the other. They picked the male one because for the most part, I mean, the people who are teaching this are men, they're priests, etc. And I think they felt that if they made God a woman, then if they're exercising their duties as a priest, are they serving, if they're serving a woman, are they serving the woman in a sexual way? And they knew the pagans were doing that. Clearly they were doing it. They were doing it both ways. They really didn't want to do that. They weren't going to have that. Now, there were male priests that were engaging in cultic homosexuality, and there were female priests who were engaging in, they encountered all of that. They just didn't, they felt, look, if we make homosexuality prohibited, then no one's going to argue that if a priest is serving God, they're doing it in a non-sexual way. And I think that was one of the hardest things. And again, look, it's not my idea. This is idea that social anthropologists have come up with for a long time when they're trying to explain what happened in ancient Israelite culture. It's a little bit even in the Da Vinci Code in Dan Brown's book. This idea of like, why did one get chosen versus the other is a major issue. By the time we get into the Zohar, we're finally getting people saying, look, we're well beyond this discussion anymore. So can we now talk about the divine feminine without freaking people out? I think so. They got away with it, and it's still being discussed today, which is why I'm jumping the gun. But when we get to the Kabbalistic ideas that we have today, which we're going to get to at the end, that's why when we greet the Shabbat as a bride, people didn't necessarily see it as a sexual thing anymore. Hello? I mean, that's pretty much God is a feminine form. God, at least in Shabbat, is a feminine form. So there was a point in time by the 12th century where Jews, and maybe it was a little bit before that, where they were able to do that. By the way, I'm only telling you what the Jewish folks were dealing with. Around the same time, you have Christian mystics, St. John, and there's visions that Teresa of Avila. There are Christians that are dealing with these same spiritual issues of God's gender and God's essence, male or female. This isn't just a Jewish issue. And maybe that also was, and some people speculate, that's why you have Jews during this period of time writing these kinds of things. But I will tell you that during this time, we can point to it. We can say, yes, that's 800 years old, 900 years old, and it's there. And it becomes then the launching point for these next things that I'm going to tell you about, which are by the 16th century, and the place where we get Lachadodi is Sfat. And that's where you get the teachings of the rabbi we call the Ari. And the Ari, which means the lion, but it's the acronym of Yitzhak Luria. This rabbi is a rabbi who lives in Sfat and who is teaching another level to the Zohar and to the Kabbalistic teachings. His book, his writings are recorded in something called the Eitz Chaim, where he is now articulating other ideas about Kabbalah, which are maybe the first time that we're seeing some of these things. It doesn't mean that he invented them, but it does mean that we're starting to see some terms and some things that we talk about that are very formulaic. We start to see things during this period of time that we recognize as groundbreaking, if you will. These are things where we start to see images and discussions and thoughts and, if you will, guides that are major parts of Kabbalah today, including the chart of the Sfirot. This is Lurianic Kabbalah, which we'll get to, not today, but this is definitely on our horizon to talk about the divine emanations, what we call the Sfirot. So this is something that we start to see during the Lurianic phase of Kabbalah that we haven't seen in the Zohar. You won't see that picture, if you will, in the Zohar. They're talking about those things, but it's not been charted. It hasn't been laid out on a framework like that. So, and we start to see these phrases, things like, like tikkun olam, repair of the world. We start to see that phrase in Lurianic Kabbalah because we're now talking about this idea that maybe the universe, the physical world, we can describe what we have as a shattering of the initial harmony that existed at the beginning of creation. that God's energy actually couldn't be contained and blows up, if you will, the Big Bang. It's one of the books that I'm going to put on the list for you to see is a book written by Daniel Matt, who's a great Kabbalist. I'm also going to give you a link to one of his discussions at Rutgers on Kabbalah, and he goes through a lot of this in detail as well. The idea that everything that we see in the physical world, everything, the chair we're sitting on, the food that you eat, everything that you encounter is part of a shattering of divine energy where everything that we see came out of an explosion, maybe the Big Bang, with all the material world is created of atoms and created of energy and created of substance. But it wasn't necessarily supposed to be that way. It was all supposed to be unified. Everything was supposed to be all connected. And it's our job to do what's called tikkun olam. Now, you know that as doing good deeds. You know that as doing mitzvot, of helping people, of reaching out. We've talked about tikkun olam as being social justice. It's actually a much deeper idea. Tikkun is cosmic repair. It's literally putting the pieces back together of God's creation. So the obvious ones are helping someone in need, someone who's suffering. They are at a level of feeling broken. And when people feel broken, like that's where we call our attention to. But actually all around us is stuff that's not supposed to be there. So then when we eat food, for example, and we say a blessing over it, we're actually elevating the energy in that food. And the reason we say a blessing over it as we eat it, this is the Kabbalistic, this is the mystical explanation for why we say a blessing when we eat something, because we're converting that energy into our bodies now. We're actually liberating that energy and putting it into our bodies. So tikkun is an idea that we see in Lurianic Kabbalah, and it's one that, again, is really important for us today. As Kabbalistic teachings move on into these next periods, we really start to see how people work with Kabbalistic teachings, Lurianic Kabbalah, in a way that's going to help us live our lives on a practical level, so that you don't have to be a student of a rabbi anymore. You don't have to be studying in an academy. You don't have to be in a yeshiva anymore. We have what's called Hasidic mysticism, which is, how do I achieve that type of union with God without necessarily even saying a word? I can hum a song, I can sing a nigun, a melody, without words, and I can elevate my spirit to the highest level without even saying a word. And so if you don't have to say a word anymore, what difference does it make whether you're saying a prayer or whether you're saying, some blessing in a formula? Because there's a level to it where you're already there. You just need to access it. And so Hasidism is really trying to teach us that there's a possibility to do this all over the place. Now, unfortunately today, Hasidism is usually associated with Black Hat Orthodox Judaism. When it first appeared in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was a radical departure from intellectual Judaism. It was seen as a heresy by Orthodox Judaism. The fact that it is Orthodox Judaism today is one of the funniest ironies of Jewish history, because the early Hasidic teachers were exiled from the community, from the organized Orthodox community. It was only after a few generations where they started saying to themselves, look, if we're going to be accepted by the yeshivas, we better get serious about studying. And so they started blending study with their mystical approaches towards not necessarily thinking about, where before we're talking about, you don't even have to be in a yeshiva, you don't even have to be in a synagogue to pray to God. Then then some of the Hasidic rabbis are starting to say, no, you can only find it if you're in the middle of study, if you're following all the laws. It becomes much more connected to orthodoxy. But originally it wasn't. And it was really looked down upon because people were talking about simple joy, dancing, singing, eating, drinking, living. All of those things were considered to be ways to elevate the spirit, elevate the soul. And it was definitely, again, along the course of stuff, taking in Lurianic Kabbalah. So much so that I will show you one thing before we move on, just because I'm going to share you a little something. Here's the Sfirot.
Will you remind me, what was the name of the other group that were against them? Mikdagim or something?
Yeah, the Meet Nagdim, which
Mikdagim?
the Meet Nagdim, which are what's what the Hasidic people called them. They called them the opposers. They were the opposers. They were the opposition. So so originally Chabad Hasidism, which is only one of the forms of Hasidism, because there's lots of Hasidic movements. That just happens to be the one that everybody knows, because it's really one of the only ones that survived World War II. Shneur Zalman, which is he's the first of the Chabad rabbis. These people come from Ukraine, pretty much. Most of the early Hasidic rabbis came from Ukraine and Poland. I mean, at that time there was no Ukraine, but it was Poland and Russia. But the area today we'd call Ukraine. And they were called, for the most part, these were Galicianers. These were Jews that were looked down on by the more refined and more educated Litvaks in northern Poland, in Lithuania. That's what Litvak means, Lithuanian. But they looked down on the ones that were closer to Ukraine and Hungary and southern Poland. Anyways, these rabbis were singing and dancing and telling everybody to, again, and before they start to get, more serious about following intellectual pursuits, the word Chabad is actually an acronym of three of those emanations: Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. So when you look at the words, the word Chabad actually, look, they're also called Lubavitch, which are the town of Lubavitch, which is where they came from. But then words also come from the emanations, from this chart. So the word Chabad is actually an acronym of Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. Chokhmah meaning wisdom, Bina meaning discernment, and Da'at meaning knowledge. Three of the emanations that deal with using your mind. So they realized that they had to kind of get back into the intellectual pursuits, but that's not where they were when they started. So we're going to talk about these in more detail especially these last ones, as we get through, including up to the modern era, where you have Rav Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, who also writes an important Kabbalistic book called the Orot, which are his collections of teachings on Jewish mysticism in modern in Israel for the last 80 years. So Rav Kook writes about how Kabbalah manifests itself in Israel. Kabbalah is very, very important in Israel. There's a huge study of Kabbalah in Israel, and it somewhat mirrors the Kabbalistic studies we have in America, which are: is this a form of Jewish magic? Is this a form of a way of kind of packaging self-help in a Jewish framework? We will talk about that at the end. It's not where we are right now, and we have to get there. So we have to get through the text to get to that. Again, if the Kabbalah is for people who are grounded and know something, now that we've gotten through this today, and there's a lot, that we've covered today. I mean, I want to say we looked at kind of the historical developments today, and I want to make sure we actually look at something that is a teaching of Kabbalah, and that is something that I'm going to share right now. Give me 1 second. So, yeah, there's so much to talk about. one of the most important ideas, by the way, in Kabbalah is that when we talk about God and we talk about, understanding God, the term that is used from the very early sources, including the Zohar, for God is Ein Sof. What is Ein Sof as a name for God? Ein Sof means without end. God is infinite. And so, interestingly, infinite is one way to describe it, but Ein Sof literally in Hebrew means no end. There's no end. And sometimes God is simply called no thing, which is not the same as nothing, because God is both not one thing. There's no anything that's not God. So God is everything. And so one of the ideas that we have in Kabbalistic teaching is that there are four worlds. We call them in Hebrew, these are the olamim, these are the worlds. Before we even had a word or understood the concept of dimensions in metaphysics, in science, Judaism had already described this, because this is a very early ideas. These ideas of worlds, they called them worlds. Olam means world. It's important to understand that these aren't four different places which you kind of think of with worlds, which is why I really like to call them four dimensions. And that's why we would say them four spiritual dimensions. We do not move between the worlds. We live in all four at once, usually unconsciously. What are we talking about? Well, just like we talk about when we talk about dimensions, this is not universes. This is not the concept of metaverses and all these other things that you've heard people talk about recently that are the basis for the Marvel universe and everything else. This is the idea that there are dimensions, and it's something that has been part of scientific discourse on kind of our existence for a while. But in Judaism, it actually goes back a long time, like over 1,000 years. And that is that we exist in different dimensions simultaneously. So you're in all of these dimensions right now. You exist in all four of them. You just don't recognize it. Or maybe you do recognize it, you just never articulated it until you start to talk about it. And these four worlds are starting from, and again, I want to be careful because we say this is the highest, because this is the one where there is no separation between you and God, where you literally feel that everything is connected. And so sometimes people feel that. They have that kind of epiphany or that kind of moment where they feel no separation between the rock that they're sitting on and themselves. They literally feel that everything in that moment is connected. It always is. It's just that, again, our minds can't work that way, and so we don't want to see it. By the way, if this sounds a lot like the Matrix, it is, because the Warshawskis also based this on their kind of theology, if you will, on a lot of Kabbalah. But the idea is it's happening right now. You just don't see it. And so Atzilut is actually an area, if you want to think about it, the realm that we exist in, where everything is connected, where all of the energy is unified. And it's really where we are, again, no longer an ego. We're no longer separated from anything. So it's very difficult to be there. We maybe aspire to be there, or maybe we do some things that try to help us get there. Like every day when we get out of bed saying the Shema. Because when we say Shema Yisrael, right, Adonai Echad, that everything is one, we actually remind ourselves that there is no separation from everything that I'm going to encounter today. It's all an illusion that we're separated. It's all the same. It's all one thing. It's all God. The next level is Bria, which is translated usually as creation. This is where we're no longer just all God, but ideas they exist. But they only exist as ideas. The concept of them. It's like there's a blueprint of, it's actually not even a blueprint. The idea is there, but hasn't been put down on a blueprint. It's the script that's in your head that you haven't put down on paper yet. It's there. It just hasn't manifested yet. And so this is a very important idea that we see reflected especially as an idea of the Torah. The Torah is giving us a level of this here where we can see the Torah. Like at Atzilut, we can't even see the Torah because the Torah is like everything else. We are the Torah. Bria, we can start to see that these are ideas, and they're the beginning, or they're the way that we start to see this stuff in real life, in our real life, which we're going to get to, because we still have another step, which is Yetzirah, which is like Bria, which is creation. This is now formation, where things are starting to exist that we do experience, especially things like emotions and feelings. So this is where we really do know this. We just can't touch it. Like if somebody says, where is your love? Where's your fear? Well, we know we feel it. It's real. But we can't touch it. We can't see it. But we know it's real. 100% we know it's real. This is also where most of us normally, the only level we get to besides the lowest level, I don't want to say the lowest level, but it's the level that we exist on here every day, and it's the area that we feel the most comfortable, if you will. But Yetzirah we do get to. We get to in prayer. We get there in feelings and emotions, and it is kind of our spiritual level. It's sometimes where music and poetry and things that are real kind of open up our heart, and then we're no longer like, that song isn't just a song anymore. So that's that level. It's also, sometimes say it's the level of angels, where I don't know where I don't see the angel, but I know the angel's there, right? It's kind of that feeling. That's why it's called like that. Sometimes people say it's like the angel of that music, or the angel that is there with us. The last level, which again is the level, not that it's the level that we're talking in right now, this level of Asiyah, this is the level where it comes into reality. Now, in a way, this is a really important level because it's the only level that we can actually know that we're having an effect, where we see the effect, where we can touch the effect, where we know what we're doing. But we're also doing all of this work in these other levels too. We just don't see it. We don't feel it. We don't always recognize it. But we're doing these things at every level simultaneously. It's just we see it in this level of Asiyah. That's why it's really a dimension. Because we're existing, you exist in the third dimension and the second dimension as well. We just don't perceive it. Also, our mind can't really perceive that, but you've seen maybe if anyone's taking you through kind of like explanations of dimensions, they'll show you like, this is what you'd look like if you're only one dimensional, right? Or they'll show you. But this is why it's really appropriate to talk about these as dimensions. So what's really important here, and again, if we can take away something that on a practical level today, we're going to finish with, is that like, if you think about when you give tzedakah to somebody, or to something, or you're helping somebody with monetarily. Now that's obviously like one of the most basic ways of doing something. It's so basic, and it's so, if you will, it's so like really it has to come down to money. Well, sometimes it does, but even though that's like, oh, I wish I didn't have to think about money, there is a level to it where it's also at the same time that you're thinking about, I'm giving somebody money, or I'm sending them money. Do I really need to give this money? I don't know. But what actually it is on another level, in the level of Yetzirah, it's an expression of that emotion of compassion. So you're experiencing something in this world. I reached in my pocket, took out the money. But on another level, you're exercising and living in a feeling of compassion. Now, at the next level, At a next level, you are understanding and actually have taken this idea of justice and trying to help somebody who's less fortunate than you, let's say. And now I'm practicing this act of justice, this idea of justice. And I understand it. I'm really, I can comprehend it. But what really is happening, of course, on the highest level, on the level of Atzilut, you are acting as literally as God's agent in creating a connection of literally helping God help that person. You're now the bridge between God and that person. Because again, you, that person, and God were all the same all along. And so this is why, like, the things that we see in this world, in this level, in this dimension, are simple, but they're not. They're much, much, much higher. And so it's hard for us to, to think about living in these other worlds, these other realities. But what's important is that this is where we do it. But it's really felt throughout all existence, through all levels. And so it's not silly. It's not like meaningless that, and it's not like, oh, I just gave somebody money, I don't really know what's happening with it. There is something that if you do it with the right intent, and again, I didn't say it from the beginning because you're all good people. When we give the money with the intention of helping somebody, right? So all of this is on the basis of, I'm doing this out of my heart. I'm doing this with my heart in the first place. If you're not, then the whole thing was never there in the first place, really. I don't know why you're doing it, but there are people who do it. Maybe they do it for their ego or because they don't really, I don't know. I don't know what the reason is, but assuming you're doing with Kabbalah, assuming you're doing with intention, that intention is real. And that intention actually at its highest level is an expression of God. It's literally that energy. Your action was the bridge of energy between making sure that person had sustenance. And that's actually what God does. When we pray to God, just give us sustenance, that's what God does. So, yeah. This all is connected to, again, the Atzilut in particular is connected to this idea that there is no separation between ourselves and God. We create that separation because it's the only way for us to function in this world usually. But at a certain level, this is all really an illusion. It's not an illusion in the Zen way, but it is an illusion in this Jewish way, if you will, which is that, again, if everything is God, then this is all just moving stuff around within God's universe. The energy is all the same. So, no. So Esther just said, how's this different than universal consciousness? It's not. What it is universal consciousness is some of the other teachings that exist in the world about this. Look, the reason I said it's not Zen is because I know it's not Zen from the standpoint of it's not an illusion. It's not nothing. It's not like this is nothing. It's not like suffering is nothingness, which is a really important idea. And it gives a lot of people strength. I'm not saying the Zen concept isn't, but from the Jewish standpoint, it's a different thing, which is, yes, it's all connected, and it's all based on this idea that there is no separation between ourselves and God. If God is everything, then we're God. We're doing God's work. We are gods. We're God's arms. We're God's. So it's not necessarily different from universal consciousness because that's definitely an element here. But I think it's a little bit bigger than that because we're also saying it's not just about what we think. This is true even if you didn't realize it. I mean, universal consciousness is trying to encourage it. I'm not saying Kabbalah is not trying to encourage it. It obviously is. But whether or not you realize it, it's still happening. So I know that was a lot to take in. We did a lot in 90 minutes. We covered a lot of ground. I promise you, next week, we're going to start looking at more of these types of teachings. This is the first one that I introduced to you, the Olamot, the worlds, the dimensions. I like to call it the dimensions, but we will talk about some of these other ideas. And by the time we finish over the next few weeks, you'll be introduced to some of these other concepts like the Sphirot, which I just showed you the chart, and some of these other concepts that are kind of the principles, if you will, because this is not, today was the history, the development. The next couple of classes are going to be, well, definitely, like, I want to get to, as I told you, why what the Kabbalah Center is doing is kind of a weird version of this, but we will get to it over the next couple of weeks. So thank you, everybody.
Rabbi,
In person next
real
week.
quick.
We will be in person next week and online. Yes, Philip, sorry. Yeah.
Rabbi, yeah, you promise at the end of this we won't go mad, right?
I promise you, not only will you not go mad, but Philip is the only person here who's seen the itinerary to Israel in November. And what do I have there in Sfat?
And he's
Philip.
gone mad.
Oh,
Kabbalah.
he's gone? Okay, good. No, he's there. What are we doing
Yeah,
in
I'm here.
Sfat?
Kabbalah.
We're doing Kabbalah in Sfat. You're going to have a day of doing Kabbalah in Sfat with the masters. So that is on the itinerary for November. All relevant.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is that why Svat's kind of artsy?
It's more than artsy. There's a level to the art that's very spiritual and very mystical. Yes. And we've only usually covered, we've gone to some of the synagogues, but this time we're going to go deep. We're going to go deeper. We're going to spend some time with some of the people who teach there and some of the people who are incorporating Kabbalistic teachings into their art and into the studies that are going on there, which are, again, was historically the center for the last 500 years, and people there are very proud of their connection to it, whether they moved there 10 years ago or whether they've been there for generations. That's our Kabbalistic center, if you will, in the world is Tzfat. Take care, everybody, and welcome to 2026. You've now had your minds blown. I don't think anyone's gone crazy yet, or if you have, I apologize. You can send me an email if you've gone crazy. Take care.
Thanks,
All right,
Rabbi. See you
Bye-bye.
Tuesday.
We'll see you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you soon. Bye-bye.